Okay, so let me get my head wrapped around this. And okay, so thanks for being here to the Jobs to Be Done framework. And I have the subproducts, seeing products differently because I think this is maybe my third presentation, possibly fourth presentation on Jobs to Be Done. And I'll admit I'd always been getting into the mechanics because a lot of people talk about the mechanics of it. But the really big difference is a perspective shift. I'm going to talk about some of the mechanics, but mostly the perspective shift that's out there. So that's why I have that subtitle. And that's actually good because I think perspective shifts, well, while a lot of people don't seem to make them, I think they're technically easier to do because they're just shifting what you look at. There's really nothing to do, just shift it. So a lot of you know me, but for those who don't, I'm Al Shalloway. I've been around a long time, and I don't really need to go through this because I don't believe in authority, so I don't care what I put up there. You shouldn't believe anything I say. You should learn to make it work for yourself. I just put it up there to let you know I've been around and I understand a lot of different things. So anything you disagree with, that's fine. Please, we can talk about it. But it's not out of my ignorance, probably. It's just we might have a disagreement or I might have said it wrong. You might have misunderstood me. So, but Jobs to Be Done is a very interesting thing. And there's a question to ask before I get into it. This is something I've been thinking about quite a lot the last few months. What is the guiding force in requirements? Now, I don't mean how do we get them necessarily. I mean, what is one of the aspects of getting requirements that's important? Because if we're building things in stages, then that means we don't know everything up front. So is there a particular way we can go about getting requirements that would be advantageous, or is there an objective to how we can get requirements? And I believe one of the biggest guiding forces is we want to understand our requirements in such a way that as they change, because they are going to change the requirements, we're still able to minimize waste from the change. In other words, we want to mitigate the cost of change of requirements. If we have, this is especially important if we have very long projects or large project, because we know the details at a minimum are going to change. But in fact, I believe, and I don't hold this out of a belief, I did this in the 80s where I wrote a lot of vertical applications, special industrial type apps. And I won't say I knew everything up front, that'd be a lie, but I knew enough up front and I was able to build a system. So as I got more detail, it caused extremely little waste. And the technique I was using in the 80s was not Jobs to Be Done because it didn't come out until 2016, but was something very similar to it, but based on a different thought process. And the reason I've never taught it before, what I did in the 80s, is because that thought process was fairly complex and pretty difficult to learn. But Jobs to Be Done accomplishes virtually the same thing in an easy way to describe. So I've gotten very excited about Jobs to Be Done because of that. And this is one of the overriding things to think about. How can we figure out what we really need without wasting, if you get too much up front, you're wasting time because a lot of those details are going to change. If you don't get enough, you're wasting your time because you're going to be surprised. You're not going to have the capacity, the people available for it, and it can cause problems. So this is an important aspect to consider. And we'll talk about this. While we require an overall view, we don't need the full detail. This is a first insight on it. So what does the overall view mean? And the question then becomes, what do we need to look at to enable discovery of new items, not cause us waste, to not cause us waste? We are going to discover new things. When I built some applications again in the 80s where I almost had no cause extra waste, and I was writing software in a way that could accommodate it as well. But one of the reasons I was able to do it is you could say I got the big things in mind and the little details didn't cause any problem. It's not unlike, I cook and entertain a lot. Sometimes have lots of people, like when the Academy Award comes, we usually have 20, 25 people over. There's karaoke, there's all sorts of things we do, costumes, and dinner for like 25 people. So there's a lot of stuff going on. So and people are changing what they need. So how do I manage this? Well, I look at the big things. I get the big things to work, the little things come into it. That's a hint, but that's what we'll see as we go. Okay. So at least let me define jobs to be done first as far as what it is. And then we can go into the details of this perspective shift. So it's a framework for understanding what someone is trying to accomplish in a given context. This is very important. Tony, I think we're getting some feedback from you. Why don't you mute yourself? It focuses on the progress they seek. So we're looking at them and how they progress toward what they're trying to accomplish. And we're going to call each step a job. So by identifying these jobs, we can design solutions that align with real goals, not just what they're asking for. So in a nutshell, the advantage of jobs to be done is it's again saying we're not trying to be complete. It's to be a guide so we can discover what we need and create minimal waste. We're looking at objectives. I suggest that the objectives don't change as much as the details. So this is the first step, okay? How you implement those objectives may very well change, but what you're trying to accomplish at a high level doesn't change so much. This can be done in very large projects. One of my favorite books is How Big Things Get Done. And in that book, he talks a lot about some software, mostly non-software things, but definitely as complex as software in my mind. And even though the details might not have been understood, the objectives of what was needed was understood. The Guggenheim Museum is a great example, but there's some others that they did. And sometimes if you don't do it the right way, you can have a lot of problems. Like the Opera House in Sydney Harbor caused a lot of waste to get it done because of the way it was brilliant design, poorly engineered thinking. The Guggenheim Museum was basically in Bilbao was designed in a way that they could figure out how to implement pieces of the design as they went. Okay. We want to shift from solutions to what we're trying to accomplish. These are two different things. Avoids becoming feature factories or being at the effect of incomplete requirements. And I put this here because we tend to look at wants and needs because that's just what we've been taught. It's the first easy thing to look at. It's where people are yelling and screaming. But we really want innovation, and I would suggest we want to look at what they're trying to accomplish. Okay, so one last bit of framework here, and then we'll get into talking more about it. But I want you to understand what I mean by a job. So a job is the progress that a person's trying to make. It's like the step by step by step, not necessarily linear. You could have networks of jobs. So it's not a way of categorizing customers or their problems. It's trying to understand why are they making those choices. So we're looking at customers in a particular context. It's not also necessarily a problem that arises, although it can be a problem. But you might actually not solve the problem. You might make it so the problem goes away, so you don't have to do the job in the first place. See, and some things, sometimes these jobs to be done, what just crossed my mind as I was saying this was, see, it's kind of interesting how Post-it notes were accidentally made. They just basically made a bad batch and they kind of didn't stick so well. But you could see that if somebody looking at the jobs to be done of putting little things on the wall, which you had to use Scotch tape for, you might have thought of it. But, it's kind of, we see these a lot after the fact. So what we want to do is to look to see how can we move forward. Okay. So there are two books I refer to a lot, Christensen's and Jobs to be Done and Competing Against Luck. I'll give some more references to those later. So let me give you an example of one of the more innovative things done, not so much with Jobs to be Done. This was done, I guess, in the 60s even. One of my business consultants I had in the 80s happened to know the chairman of Sony, Kiyo Morita. So he would sometimes get these interesting stories. He knew a lot of interesting people. That's where I got introduced to Buckminster Fuller, was through this guy who knew him as well. And he'd tell all these fascinating stories that you never hear anywhere else. And I got to admit, sometimes I wonder if he made them up, but they were really fascinating and interesting nevertheless. So it's focused on what's to be accomplished. So Morita he traveled a lot. Okay. He was the CEO of Sony, and he also liked classical music. Now, remember, you're in the 60s. uh, or early 70s. I don't remember the exact time that it came out. I remember owning one around that time, so I knew it came out by then. And he liked classical music, but he could not hear it on the airplane because they didn't have like iPads, iPods, all those things, music, internet on the airplane. And he was reportedly on a hotel, I think, overlooking a Central Park in New York City, and he looked down and he could see that people were like jogging, the jogging craze, and some people walking with boom boxes. Um, and if you saw somebody running with a boombox, then that was another story, given it's New York City. But the point was, the people who were jogging, he noticed, had a commitment to fitness, and the people who were having the boomboxes had a commitment to music, and there was nothing that existed to do both. So he had two jobs, but no product to fill the jobs. So he wondered what could do both. You could have a boombox, that's one job. You can have fitness, to another one. And the idea of a Walkman came up in his mind. And that was the birth of the Walkman idea. Now, what's interesting about this is he then had a hard time getting his developers to build Walkmans because it was a new concept. They kept thinking he wanted a smaller tape recorder. What he wanted was a tape player that was portable. Okay. And basically, they kept giving him smaller and smaller tape recorders until he said, the next time you bring me a tape recorder, I don't care how small it is, because he knew if it didn't have the record heads, it would be even smaller. And that's what he was going for. The next time you give me a smaller tape recorder, you're fired. So then they realized they had to shift their perspective. So maybe shifting a perspective is not so easy, because he was telling his developers to stop shifting the perspective of the tape recorder to shifting to the perspective of the person carrying it. See, so this whole thing is a shift of perspectives. Jobs to be done is a framework for helping you do that. Like I said, there are other ways to do it, and people do this a lot. And people in Agile do this sometimes as well, but it's not as consistent as it could be. And that's my issue with it. Okay, so I got one more story and then we'll get into it, because this story was told in Christensen's book, Competing Against Luck. And what he meant by competing against luck was, if you're looking at wants and needs, that's just luck. So you want to compete against luck. You want to be better than luck. And the way you're better than luck is to look for jobs that need to be done. So he tells this story of where he was hired, or his company was hired, to help this company sell more milkshakes, and how they could market it, what they could do. And what they noticed, so they thought, well, if I'm a marketing company, I'm getting more milkshakes, and what I want to do is I want to pay attention to who's buying them and seeing why. And what they noticed, it seemed to be a disproportionate number of professional looking people who were buying milkshakes. It just seemed odd to them that in the morning, that this would be happening. So they did some interviews, and they found out that a lot of the people who were buying milkshakes were people who are commuting to work. And the milkshake was why they bought a milkshake was, it was convenient in the car. It wasn't messy. So if you buy a breakfast burrito, you're brave or stupid or incredibly neat. I couldn't eat one in a car while I'm driving. It doesn't distract you from driving because you can just hold it in one hand easily. It was sort of entertaining because if you got bored, you just take a sip. And it lasted a lot of the time it takes you a while to drink it. So it lasted a long time. So the milkshake was actually not what you might think as just breakfast, but they were hiring it to entertain, keep them occupied, be neat, and quench their hunger. So that was the job to be done. And that's an interesting way to look at products. Instead of saying it's a milkshake and it's built this way, to look at this is something that entertains people. But now this was another thing that happened, is they noticed that these same people would get milkshakes in the afternoon, but for a different job. In the afternoon, it was like they'd bring their kid in. There's father, son, mother, son. Mother, son, mother, daughter, whatever. The job there was to do something with your kids, to have a bonding moment. I'm a parent of several kids and grandkids, and I admit there are times I don't do things I really hate or anything, But there are times I do things that I'm just lukewarm on, but I do it with my kids. Why? Because I really love being with my grandkids or my kids. So jobs are sometimes not at all what they at first look to be, like a milkshake in the afternoon, but can be doing some other job. Now, if you're marketing, this is really useful to notice. Okay, any questions at this point about what a job is and the general idea of the jobs to be done? I haven't really explained how perspective shift, but I'm open for questions. Okay, we're good. I think the easiest way, well, there really are two levels here. There is a detailed level of how do you do it. There are jobs to be done stories. There's a variety of things. But the first thing to do is consider it to be mostly about perspective shifts, like from features and personas to progress and outcomes at one level. So most teams think in terms of products, features, and personas. We want to ask, what progress is the customer really trying to make? Like if you're setting up an accounting system, you don't think about what the accounting system is as much as you look at, well, what are the steps it takes to, or financial system, what are the steps it takes to get my account set up, things like that. How do I make it easier? This shifts you to the perspective of the customer and the user. And this is what I mean by perspective shift. Instead of looking at your system, I'm adding features to the system. I'm going to say this again. Instead of saying I'm adding features to the system, what I'm doing is I'm making the jobs the customer has to do to get done easier and more applicable to them and possibly more innovative. So here's the first shift. We shifting from demographics, in other words, who we have, to the context they're in. So it's not as important to who they are as what situation they're in. For example, like we could have customers defined by age, gender, income, role. That's a common way of doing it. Instead, we're going to say, what's the situation they're in when they hire a product to make progress? So the market segmentation shifts from people are to when and why they act. We're shifting to looking at how they're acting, not what they are. An example is like a 40-year-old executive and a 20-year-old student both hire Uber when stuck in the rain. They're different market segments from a demographic point of view, but the same from a context point of view. Now, there's a takeaway. Marketers maybe should segment by situation, not persona, or by both, but we often don't think in terms of the situation. We think in terms of the persona. I'm not going to pause for every one, but I want to pause for this because this is the model I'm using for the 8 personas, the 8 perspectives. And I find this kind of good. It's like, what were we doing? What do we want to shift to? What a summary of this is, an example and a takeaway. Is this clear enough? Is there a question on this? Okay, well, I'll go to the next one. I'm going to go through 8 of these. There are 8 perspectives. Okay. What they use is not as important as what problem they solve. Okay. So it's not a question of products being bundles of features. They're tools for customers to achieve progress toward a desired goal. Do you see this shift from the system to the people involved? Now, this is important because a lot of times dev don't do this. So we don't say, what should we build? What progress is the customer trying to make? Do you see when we say, what should we build? We're starting to think of, okay, we'll get wants and needs and then we solve their problems. But if we ask what progress are they trying to make? Well, there are multiple ways to make progress. This is why innovation can come into the picture. Maybe the way they're trying to do it isn't the best way. Maybe there's another way to make progress. Okay. So Spotify's on offline mode is interesting. That's a feature, but the idea is how do you keep your gym routine uninterrupted when Wi-Fi drops? See, now you might even go further. Okay, we've got an online, but an offline mode, but is there an offline mode you want when you're in the gym? See, I wish Spotify had an offline mode in the gym that said unlock the controls. I wouldn't have thought about that as a feature. I don't know if you've ever used, I've learned how to put my phone in a way where it doesn't accidentally get touched by me while I'm exercising. Okay. So when you look at how they are, that's helpful. So devs and PMs, project managers, prioritize features that unlock progress. Now, here's the thing. You could say, And I don't know, I might be if I was in your situation. Well, wait a moment. Isn't this just attending to the customer journey? And aren't you just repeating what's been said we should be doing? And the answer is yes, it is attending to the customer journey. And I am repeating what's said. But notice how this builds attending to the customer journey into it. What's nice about this approach is it integrates what you should be doing, what you might even know you should be doing, might even know how to do it, but mostly is not done. And that's one of its powers. It's not like, oh, if you don't do this, you're never going to succeed. No, I'm not saying that. But it's a more natural way of doing things. And that's what's exciting to me about that. Wants versus outcome. Look, wants are driven by problems they face. That means, what do you do when you have a problem? You have a solution. But what if you shouldn't have that problem? Or maybe there's an easier problem to have to solve. So it's funny, I was talking about maybe you can avoid the problem entirely, but sometimes you can come up with a different problem to have that's easier to solve. I actually talked about this in a test case where we did some analysis. I called it using value streams and 5 whys. And what we found out, there was a problem that when they didn't configure a company that was building web services for other people, when they didn't, the customer didn't configure their machines properly, it caused a lot of problems. And then it was causing the developers to get blocked and the lead was gone. So it was causing like something that occurred only 5% of the time was causing 20% of their effort waste. And the problem that they first thought about was, well, we have a problem, they're not configuring their servers, or that we have a problem, the developers aren't writing robust code. Well, looking at this, the problem wasn't whether the code was robust or not. The problem was, do we even need to have it in a situation where it needed to be robust? So that was solving a simpler problem, and that can be useful. So customers have needs that are often expressed as vague wants. Now, of course, they can be made better, but now you're going into detail that might change, like I want faster delivery. So customers define success in measurable outcomes. You know, reduce time, minimize effort, increase certainty. There's an implication that a shared measurement language between marketing and development will emerge as we talk about this, because we're getting more specific about what's the outcomes we want. This helps avoid the outcomes outputs issue. Like I want healthier meals becomes reduced time to take to prepare a fresh meal. Now, what's interesting is we can translate these into measurable outcomes. Not that we necessarily measure them. Tom Gill would call these quantitative. Make it quantitative, at least understand what's moving in the right direction. So sometimes we can't measure it, but we can always make it quantitative, that we want to reduce the time to prepare meals. Like we want this meal kit to be at least twice as easy to make as from scratch or something like that. We often look at competitors. Oh my goodness, this is who we're competing against. But in the Jobs to Be Done book, this was, trying to remember if it was Ulrich or Christensen or both of them. I think it was Christensen, but I suspect Ulrich talked about it as well. You often look against your competitors, but sometimes your competitors, they don't do anything. So competitors are other companies, or competitors are any alternative, including non-consumption. So you may not have any competitor like a company, but you might want to say, well, I'm going to have people do this instead of doing nothing. Again, we brought in our competitive radar. We look at companies and we look at the stasis people might have. How do we get them to overcome doing nothing? As opposed to how do we get better than our competitors? You get how that's a little different? Just one more insight. Okay. The Kindle doesn't just compete with books, but also with Netflix, podcasts, and just sitting on the couch. Marketers and PMs have to look beyond the industry. See, this is what I love about this model. By the way, you may have noticed, and I'll confess because I'm not embarrassed by it. Somebody may have noticed. Look at those. Yes, I use ChatGPT to build this thing. Why? Because I've had ChatGPT understands Amplio. It knows my approach, and it knows Jobs to Be Done. And then I changed it, of course. It's just the backbone of the talk. because it provides insights to things. So this is just like a little extra takeaway. If you're preparing a paper, I'm not saying have it write the whole paper, but if you're preparing a talk, it's often a really great way to get a essence of what to do. So if you notice that, that's why. And I don't see any problem with that. I don't see any problem when people do that. This is the really big one. Looking at wants and needs focuses on solutions to problems, starting with jobs, enable us to create innovative solutions because we can do more discovery. You know, we kind of recognize this because we say, well, we don't want customers to give us solutions, but then we go and listen to their wants and needs, which implies solutions, or at least a limited set of solutions. So the new view is teams start with understanding the customer's job, then develop solutions. This is one of the biggest problems in the agile space right now. One of the biggest problems I see with the role of the product owner, which I've never, well, I won't say I never quite liked. When it was the team and you actually had somebody who could fulfill the product owner role, truly understanding what was going on with the customer, that was fine. But very soon, most Scrum teams, most Agile teams, the developers don't really know what's going on with the customer. They're isolated because the product owner is making all the decisions. Now, you might say, but it doesn't have to be that way. And I say, yeah, I don't care. It doesn't have to be that way. I like to look at what does show up. I'm a systems thinker. And part of systems thinking is recognizing that the way a system is designed, intentionally or not, gives you the behavior you're getting from the system, intentionally or not. So I'm not saying it's designed this way intentionally, but when you have somebody who's got the authority, it kind of diminishes the feeling of motivation and authority by the rest of the people because, well, I'm going to get overvoted anyway. And then we wonder why people disengage. The model should be the product owner as kind of a role, and it could be done by the whole team. One of the ways I was able to build software in the 80s with almost no, that wasn't the only time I could do this, but I'm saying back then I could do this. That's the more important thing. I didn't get amnesia and forget how. But back then what I would do is I would always spend a lot of time learning the business. In fact, there were 2 or 3 businesses where they were involved a lot of times. Some of you heard me talk about the hair salon. That was an extreme case when I was in the hair salon business for several years. And at one time, I actually was participating in my partner's salon university where I would actually could run salons and gave people ideas on how to run salons. And we used Deming, a lot of stuff with Deming and inventory back then. But there was another case where I was probably in the top percent. I wasn't in the top 5%, but I was maybe in the top 5 to 10% of people who knew how to do public warehousing. Public warehousing is where somebody else has the facility and you just give them the stuff and their intake and they'll do fulfillment for you. It's not like these where you rent the room or something. Public warehouse is very sophisticated, very complicated, has lots of rules. And because there are lots of things you might warehouse in it, lots of odd things. And when I got into this at a bonded warehouse in Atlanta, when I lived there, I was fortunate. There was this guy who could have retired, but didn't because he just liked working. And for whatever reason, I latched onto him and he liked that I did. I guess it was because most of the people weren't giving older guys much credit. And I said, this guy knows more about this than anybody, except maybe the owner, who's also real smart. So I learned all the details of bonded warehousing. I've forgotten them all now pretty much, but I remember some of them. And when I wrote software for that, I didn't pay attention to the system as I was writing as much as I was the jobs to be done by people in accounting, by people in billing, by people who picked up the stuff with off the pallets with the little drive, the little tractor things or whatever you call them. And we had a really good system. So it shifted from the system to the jobs to be done by different people. So we need to, the reason we can frame the work around validated problems, why we mean validated problems, we can see what their job is. We can see the problem to the job. This is not the problem to the want and need. This is the problem to their job. And then, like we could say the job for a payment app is make my transfer safe. The role is frame backlog items around objectives. Again, remember, objectives won't change much. How we implement the objective may change. This is a good example. You can imagine how you could change the objectives for security any number of ways. You can change the implementation of the objective for security any number of ways, but the objective is not going to change. This is very important. Um, there's another aspect to this that has nothing to do with jobs to be done, but I can still remember. I should probably integrate the two, but I'm going to say it now kind of to remind me, and I'll have it here. I remember, oh, who knows when, it was 15 years ago. Um, Lean in the construction business was not always a big deal. It is now. People discovered this ways back. Well, a couple of people discovered it a long time ago, but about 15 years ago, it started getting much more popular. And here was something that a major supplier of construction material, like wood, concrete, stuff like that, the builders use, had understood lean. I think this is around 2005 or six, because I think it's when the lean book came out by the Poppendicks, and I think that inspired this. And I was doing a design patterns course because I used to do a lot of technical training, and I had like 5 days there, and I pretty much got them through all the technical stuff in about 3 or 4 days. So I had some extra time. They knew I also knew Agile. So they started asking me, okay, we have to build this entire system. Where do we start? Now, what's interesting about lean in the construction business is you don't just think about what you're doing, you think about your customer. Now, think about this. If you're building a construction site and you're building, like, say, 20 houses, and you're going to get all this information, all these materials and things, you don't want them just dumped on the ground in one place, because then you're going to have to come and get stuff and move it around all over the place. And you don't even want it dumped at each location near the house, because you don't use it in any random order. You use the concrete to get the foundation, you use wood to get the sides up, you use the trusses on top. So what you want is to have the materials placed in the order so that as the construction people use it, they have less waste moving it around, getting things out of the way. Does that make sense? This is just a lean concept. It's straightforward when you think about it, but the reason they thought about it, because it's a lean concept, we're trying to minimize waste, minimize movement, all that. So they asked me, well, what order should they do things in? So we knew what the objectives were, but this is another part besides job to be done. I'm segueing a bit, but I think it's worth mentioning. So what I noticed was some things were clearer than other things. They knew some things, right? They knew some things in pretty good detail. We knew the material. We knew we needed a bill of material with an ordering system of how to pay it down. One thing I would suggest that happens is core information is often more certain than the stuff you're not quite sure about, obviously. But you can build the core information first. In other words, there is a correlation between what you have to build first and how certain you are that's of what you need to be building. So I said, let's work on the things we know we have to build first, and that'll lay the foundation. So we're kind of doing the same thing here. In what I just said with the construction, it was about the design of the system. Here, I'm saying the objectives are core and first and less likely to change. So there's a parallel here, and the two go together. Okay. It's not one and done. Look for ongoing value. See, sometimes the value is delivered at the time of purpose, but some jobs are continuous. Products are rehired or fired. We have to think of the customer life cycle, not just the journey. Meal kit services are rehired every week or fired if they don't meet the thing. And that can change. I used a meal service once. I used the meal service not so much it was easier, not so much that I couldn't cook, because I'm a good cook, but I ordered all the meals of types, cuisines that I didn't know how to cook. So I was not doing, at the time I did this, I didn't know too much about Italian cooking. I knew a lot about Italian eating food, but I'd never really cooked it. So I went to Italian, and then went to some Asian stuff. And then every time I would do some of the meals, I then knew how to do Italian cooking and Asian cooking and things like that. And then after a while, I stopped using the service. Why? Because they weren't giving me enough variety. And that's okay, because that wasn't their business model. People like me would probably have them too scattered. But that's an example. So we design for retention and continuous value. Do you see how looking at the job to be done does all this stuff naturally? It's not a checklist, but it kind of creates that. Two more to go. User stories to job stories. Instead of value, we switch to the objectives. We can see more solutions. The old view has a persona. I want features so I can achieve some goal. The new view is this is what I call the job story. When I'm in this situation, I want this motivation. I want to do something because of the motivation so I can get this outcome. So developers and products gain clearer context about why a feature matters, not just the benefit of the feature. What is it about this that's having this take place? When I'm boarding a plane with kids, I want to scan quickly so I don't hold up the line. I don't want to get the line held up. Code toward the solution, not the role. The shift for developers is massive, in my opinion, because what makes developers good is also a weakness. Okay, as a former developer, I can speak to this, and as senior developers, I did like a huge amount of coding from 70 when I started, probably started slowing down in the late 90s when I got more and more into coaching and training and then consulting. One of the things that keeps devs going is a high passion for getting stuff done. There's just a burning desire, but that burning desire sometimes gets you focused like blinders. And the focus you have is the system. So this takes you off that a little bit and sees more about the context. Okay. Here's the other thing. See, user focus was fine for teams. This is another thing. When you had a team and you had a user, when you had a team, in fact, XP, one of the rules was have an on-site user. And Scrum was have a product owner who can stock for the customer. But it has us miss people who are important because we're now beyond the team. And there are other stakeholders, sponsoring who pays for it, consuming. Now, sponsoring stakeholders could be the customers, but it could be an executive does it because we're doing it for our customers or something. Consuming, that's who's using it. Constraining, this could be other, like the IRS, you got to give them stuff, tax laws, whatever it is, some software system you're dealing with. And then value-adding stakeholders, these are the people building it. Okay, last one. We shift from inside out. Most software is built from the pieces. What are the capabilities and offerings instead of what's the overall objective again? See the overall picture, break it down instead of take little pieces and put them together. Cross-functional teams align around customer progress language rather than departmental KPIs. So you can see better alignment. We can see across teams because everybody sees and focuses on the jobs. See, Apple's AirPods weren't wireless earbuds. They solve seamless connection and portability. Everyone aligned to customer progress. I should say stakeholder progress, but it's a focus on the job. Okay. So this is a recap. I just put all 8 of them there. You can look at that. And I love this quote by Edgar Schein. We do not think and talk about what we see. We see what we're able to think and talk about. And I know some of you have heard this joke before, but I'm going to tell it anyway. What the metaphor with the lamppost is this policeman sees this guy crawling around on his hands and knees under the light in a lamppost. And he wonders what's going on. And he says, "Excuse me, sir, can I help you?" And the guy says, "Sure, officer." And the policeman says, What are you doing?" He said, "I'm looking for my keys." And now the guy can tell he's had a little bit too much to drink. I mean, the policeman can. So he gets down there, hands his knees to looking for the keys, can't find them. And finally he says, "Are you sure you dropped them here?" And he says, "No, officer, I dropped them down there in the alley." So I said, "Why are we looking here?" "The light's better." Wants and needs are easier and the light's better, but they give you solutions. They don't give you innovation. They don't give you all these other things. Each of these give you something. I should actually have a summary with what it gives you besides what it is, but that's in the deck. Okay, I got a few more slides. We'll still have time for Q&A, but I'll pause at this point for Q&A if there is any. Or not an extension of how we might do it, but if there's something you misunderstood or you don't agree with. Okay. This is the essence. People don't buy products. They hire them to make progress. If you remember one thing, focus on the job, not the product. Attend to the context the job is being done in. And this is the big one to me. Jobs to be done enables earlier discovery of objectives that lower the waste further down in the value stream when the details become more apparent. This is very important. This is part of the idea that the iron triangle is not, as maybe a big segue, I'm not going to go too much, but I have articles on this. See, the fact that scope, quality, and time are fixed is just not true. Toyota proved this wasn't true back in the 70s. But one aspect of it is what are the different ways we can eliminate creating waste? When you do jobs to be done, you create less waste, which means you can get more done in less time and with higher quality. Jobs to be done is a critical piece of that. When I go into places, I'm actually preparing a proposal. Talked to somebody a couple of days ago, and their big concern is, well, it's all the executives and managers they don't understand, and they're overwhelming me. And they say, yeah, it's good if we can figure out how to work more efficiently. But what we really need to do is get these people better. Well, the nice thing is, well, that's true. The problem is it's hard to do just something up at the front because they want to see results. And some results can be done by the way you're doing things after the executives. And jobs to be done is one of those. Quickest value releases are another. This is what we call value by design. It's part of the Amplo system. Okay, an executive summary, improve agile outcomes. Don't just talk to customers, look at how they're working. We get misguided features because of user proposed solutions. Increases rework because of misalignment with actual goals when we discover it later. Systems function as designed but fall short in real world use. Sometimes people say, well, we gave them what they wanted. Well, great. That's not your job. Your job is to give them value. You should know more than they know to get them what they need. Okay. Offers a more effective alternative because you're not getting these surface level. Customers are typically not trained or capable of thinking to what's going on under the covers, that they are very good at their jobs. I in the 80s, again, some of the systems I built were first-time customer systems for people. Sometimes it was extending them. And I remember being impressed on the edge of amazement how people could get some complex things done without computers at all. I mean, the few times I built something without a computer. So people are smart and they're very capable, but they're good at their job. They're not good at thinking in systems and building software. So of course, what they want and need, why would you expect that's going to be a good solution? Because they're not good at seeing deeper issues. Okay. The key benefits, I mentioned these: alignment, reduces rework, improves innovation, and enhances usability because you're attending to how it's actually going to get used. The bottom line is perspectives are shifted. This is a big one. It shifts developers to stakeholders, avoids becoming feature factories. You talk about user stories. To do this, it's not enough. You've got to include the context. And jobs to be done replaces reactive requirements, or you're trying to, just, again, you're getting people reacting to their problems instead of thinking what really is going to make a difference. And it's about value received. This enables moving with certainty, with little waste taking place. Okay. I think I mentioned these, but I just put them here as a kind of a summary of things. Developers understand context so they don't become feature factories. By including stakeholders, you can align and you don't get waste. Just a different way of saying what I just said. Okay. In the jobs to be done by Ulwick, he goes into great depth about why focusing on wants and needs doesn't work. You've probably all heard the story of the drill. They didn't really want to drill. They wanted holes in the wall. Well, maybe they didn't even really want holes in the wall. They wanted to put pictures up. Well, maybe they didn't really want pictures to put up. Maybe they wanted to decorate their hallway. In my houses, I've got decorations all over the place. I've got paintings up there. I've sometimes had the walls painted with faux. What's the job? Is it to have a pretty wall? Is it to have remembrances of events? See, but someone will say, oh, I want to get these up. They've already got a solution in mind and they've left the possibility of something better. So I'm going to bring one last thing into this. Because a lot of people would say, well, isn't this part of design thinking? And I would say, yes, it is. But again, I think the jobs to be done. I'm not saying don't do design thinking. I love design thinking. and maybe you do both, but jobs to be done gets a lot of design thinking done for you, because in jobs to be done, identify the real job as opposed to exploring. Well, they're both discovery. Understand constraints. There's a lot of parallel between the two. So you could use jobs to be done to diagnose the right problem, then maybe apply design thinking. That's not actually how I do it in the Amplio system, but at some point I thought this was interesting. And there is an article in this thing. This is how I combine things in jobs to be done and design thinking. So design thinking actually has a discover, define, develop, and deliver. I'm not going to go through this, but it's not just this, not developing, it's a lot of the discovery. Well, this jobs to be done gets you the equivalent of this really nicely in a very straightforward way. And then the develop and deliver, we use human-centered design. How do you now, okay, this is the job I'm going to implement. How do I implement it in a way that is the way people like to see it? Okay, so I'm done with the talk. We got 10 minutes. I'm just going to put this up here. I'm calling it an advanced product management with jobs to be done. I'm starting this next week. The way Amplio learning journeys work, I used to call it Amplio University, but now I'm just calling it Amplio Learning Journey Suite, is every 3 months I take on a new kind of workshop and present it one session a week for 3 months. And this is starting September 18th. It's only $49 a month. These are live sessions. And interspersed with that will be other things, but we've just completed what was the Amplio Consultant Educators about how to be a consultant and do things of that sort. So I'm just leaving this up here, but we got 10 minutes for you to ask me questions. Where to go next? Something I said you didn't like, something you've got a question about, whatever it is. Yeah, Tony, you're muted. You're muted because I told you to be muted.
I listened to you. I did what you suggested. Yes.
Exactly.
It sounds like the jobs to be done versus design thinking. The jobs to be done seems to be more portable. By that I mean design thinking might be a longer process,
Yeah.
requires more detailed thinking and graphing and plotting and so forth. So the jobs to be done seems like a very practical, uh, not just effective, but also a practical approach to things.
The thing I like about
That's
it
me.
over design thinking, and again, I'm not saying which one's better, because design thinking, as you get more and more into it, has some very interesting innuendos, and I'm not saying don't learn those. But I remember, first of all, sometimes design thinking, when they portray it, it's more like pulling a rabbit out of the hat. And, like when sometimes people use design thinking and they forget kind of the discovery process. Like if you've been at a conference where they talked about, we need to get a low cost incubator in underdeveloped countries that need to get preemies to place it. And that's just really the trap. You do have to do this. But when I read and try to study design thinking, it's just harder for me to grasp how to do that, whereas jobs to be done is easier. So it may be jobs to be done as a first step, and then you go to design thinking. I don't know, but I'm happy enough with where jobs to be done gets me. Susan, you want to talk about this or a new question?
About this.
Yeah, please.
I can't say that I've deeply explored design thinking, but the exposure I had to it, I was thinking, there needs to be some analysis here as well as design.
Yeah, and that's what they mean with a discovery, and then the define. But it's not as consistent in my mind. HBR has a good book on design thinking, and I was reading that, and I was about halfway through it, and I said, "Well, this is great. Sure sounds good," but there seemed to be a lot of hand waving to me. And what I mean by that is not hand waving like it wouldn't work, but hand waving like I had to figure out how to do it. Whereas jobs to be done is not. It's not do this, 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 and this, but it sets up a nice structure. That's why it's called the jobs to be done framework. It sets up a framework within which to speak, to deal with. I mean, and even if you do exactly what you do now, but you do these 8 perspective shifts, you will make a lot of progress. And that's what I really like about it, is that progress from the perspectives, which is quick. Yeah, Sonia. Oh, you're muted. Yeah.
So, yeah. So in the double diamond processor, I was having a discussion with a CX UX designer on Monday. There's a lot of overlap between requirements, Susan, and this design thinking type stuff. They have if you're thinking design and CX UX, they have structures in terms of how they go about getting what we would call requirements. So I think there's like an 8P process. There's the whole how might you, like there's, they have a lot of frameworks to use. But some people tend to be hardcore and you have to follow this framework and this is the theory. And some organizations teach what you do in practice when you actually go into organizations. So this is an area of thinking that I'm really interested and intrigued to learn more about.
Yeah, it's here's the thought, and I actually might put this out on a website to get some ideas. I'm just going to make a graphic here. Let's say the solid line. Oops, what did I just do? I don't know what I did. Okay. Okay. Let's say the solid line here that goes up. To me, the thing I like about jobs to be done is it doesn't take much time to learn how to use it effectively. So I'm saying, oh, this is like time and this is level of effectiveness. So this part I would say is definitely true, that doing design thinking, I can do design thinking reasonably well, but only because I've already been doing something like it. But when you do it new, I find it's problematic. Now, whether design thinking will get better than jobs to be done, to be candid, I don't know, because I'm not an expert in design thinking. It would be interesting if somebody knows both could talk to that. I'm not one able to talk to that. But what I know is this, and this is probably a very strong central part of Amplio. Amplio is not designed to get you to be expert in everything or in one thing. It's designed to give you some expertise in all the pieces you need. Because my experience is that it's not that hard to get awareness and some capability in a broad base. And then if you find in your situation you need to learn more, there are any number of people you could go to figure out how to be expert. Now, that's just an approach philosophy, and that's kind of another reason I like jobs to be done. Okay, other questions? Still got a couple minutes.
Well, one of the things I like about the jobs to be done approach is it puts the focus squarely on what before you worry about how.
Yeah. Yeah, and you could say that looking at the problems and solutions, but when you say solve the problem, then you might not be looking at the right thing. So I'm agreeing with you. But I mean, some people would defend, well, I'm looking at how to solve a problem, but you get misled by it. In fact, it's the justification for design thinking is why wants and needs aren't good, and this gives you an alternative approach. You look at this is, instead of this is my solution, this is not even my problem, this is what I'm trying to accomplish. So I'm agreeing. It just creates a lot of alignment. Any other questions? Are we all good? Okay. Then thanks for being here. I'm going to get this posted up on the site. And I'll send a note out to the community practice. That's now all the talks are done through that. And we're using the same Zoom link for all of them. Makes it simpler, although hopefully there wasn't a lot of confusion moving to it this time. But anyway, thanks for being here. I'll be in touch.
Thanks.